σήμερα με την παρουσία του Υπουργού κυρίου Ανδρέα Ζαΐμη να υποδεχόμαστε την κυρία Ginger Zaimi, ποιήτρια και δεύτερον ποιήτη των Pythagorian κύριων Slonimsky, Αμερικάνους και τους δυο, οι οποίοι θα μας απασχολήσουν, είμαι σίγουρος, με μεγάλη επιτυχία και με μεγάλη ευχαρίστηση για τους ακροατάς των που είμαστε εμείς, σε θέματα της ειδικότητός των ο καθένας. Έχουμε να κάνουμε με διανοητάς λογοτέχνας. Αντιλαμβάνεστε την σημασία του θέματος το οποίο θα μας απασχολήσει. We are very proud in presence of the Minister Andreas Zaimis to have with us Mrs. Ginger Zaimis, who is a poet, and another poet who is a Pythagorean. Mr. Lex Slonimsky. Both Americans, and I am sure what we are going to hear from them, from both of them, will be not only interesting but also very enriching for all of us. Thank you for coming, and we are going to listen to you.
Thank you.
Please,
Yes.
he will start.
Yes,
Yes, please take the floor.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you for your introductory comments, and thank you to Dr. Prometheus for inviting me really last May when I gave a talk at the Athens Center, more a poetry reading, and this is sort of related to that, but much more going into the intellectual discoveries I have made since 2002, when I began writing poems while basically pretending to be Pythagoras, and really first becoming acquainted with him and then doing the research afterwards, which I've been doing now for 14 years, and which has brought me many fascinating discoveries about who Pythagoras really was, about what his role has been for the maybe 1,200 years after his death in approximately 500 BC, which brought him into contact with the very germination of poetry in the Western world in the forms of his influence on Dante and his influence on Petrarch, perhaps still the greatest poets from the Renaissance going forward, and both of whom I have discovered were not only greatly influenced by Pythagoras, but had Pythagoras in their worldview as a completely trans-fictional figure, okay? And that is something that I certainly have lived 6 decades in Western culture and never knew anything about it all. And if you trace the line forward from Dante and Petrarch, particularly for one example, Shakespeare, who most historians agree his favorite writer was Petrarch, and all the way up to the present, you see that Pythagoras, just in the realm of poetry and also in many other areas, is a figure of profound importance in the history of the world that really has never gotten any credit for who he has been, primarily because in the first few centuries after Christ, Pythagoreanism was perceived as a rival belief system, and it was a powerful belief system. It was the second largest party in the Roman Senate, for example, at about 100 AD, and a lot of the historical memory has been obliterated because of this conflict with the church. So I'm here really to give my own story in terms of how I became involved with this narrative, but I also think it's very important for me to add here and there some of the historical resonance that Pythagoras has, which also places, interestingly to me, as someone who has always loved, Greek culture and history, it really puts, ancient Greece in a much more central role in what goes on today in the world of poetry than anyone ever thinks about. Okay, we all think about the Renaissance as beginning with the great, poets Dante and Petrarch, and of course we think about Roman poets like Ovid, who famously wrote the 15th book of the Metamorphoses almost entirely about Pythagoras. But I certainly did not know, and I don't think the world of scholarship knows how much further along to the 13th century, which is Dante and Petrarch, and the Shakespearean sonnets, which are 16th century, straight on to the present. So I really don't have time today, obviously, for a detailed examination, but I do want to go through a narrative that begins with how I got involved with Pythagoras and goes all the way up to recent scholarship, very recent scholarship, and what it says about the Pythagorean Dante-Petrarch connection. So let me begin, it's kind of an irony of standing here today talking in terms of the seemingly accidental nature about how I made this discovery, and that requires a little bit of personal background, which I'll give as briefly as possible. I wrote poetry for many years, actually, from the time I was in college, in what is the conventional form in the United States, for the most part still is, and that's free verse. Poetry that's not in strict meter or rhythm, and that is the poetry that dominates, the educational establishment, the MFA programs, and it also, gets the majority of the attention and the prizes, although metrical verse has made a comeback in the last 20 years, and probably half of the last 8 Pulitzer Prizes have gone now to poets who write in form, but it's still considered secondary. But I studied in a PhD program at the University of Pennsylvania with a very distinguished poet, Daniel Hoffman, who was the Poet Laureate of the United States back in 1973-74 under the predecessor title of Consultant in Poetry to the Library of Congress. And in his workshop, which I was a student in while I was studying for a PhD at the University of Pennsylvania, he introduced the class to many different forms and many different traditions in poetry, which I hadn't really received that education previously in the American university establishment treatment of poetry that really began in the 1950s and continues up to the present. And I wrote initially sonnets for a couple of years in what is called the Elizabethan or Shakespearean form, which is a traditional rhyme scheme of the first 3 quatrains with the letters standing for repetitive sounds, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, G, G. I mean, that's the traditional sonnet form as it was developed in England in the 1500s, and the only other requirement really being that the last 2 lines have an epigrammatic thought to them. But there is a much, or an equally important earlier form, which is called the Petrarchan sonnet, and that is a simpler form, fewer rhymes because it's easier to rhyme in Italian, an octave and then a sestet, and a little bit more flexibility in the rhyme scheme. So it would open A, BBA, and then some variation of CDE in the second octave. And in this period, which is about 15 years ago, I was reading, not in any kind of concentrated or organized way about the history of the sonnet. And I was aware that I had only written Elizabethan sonnets, and I was walking actually through a park in northern New York City on a particular Saturday morning, and I had told myself at the beginning of the walk that I was going to try on this walk to write a Petrarchan sonnet. Incredibly, when the walk started, I misremembered Petrarch's name as Pythagoras. And the oddity of this is that I knew nothing about Pythagoras. All I knew was the theorem, which he's famous for, and of course regarded as a mathematician, which in fact he had nothing to do with. It's been uncovered in Egyptian archival references as long ago as the 8th century BC, which is 300 years before Pythagoras lived, and there's no historian who believes that Pythagoras actually originated this sonnet. There is a sonnet, I'm continuing to make interesting historical mistakes even as I speak. But so, you know, he may have used the theorem, which has applications, particularly in farming and in architecture, to impress his followers in terms of organizing the movement that he did, and very possibly no one in Samos or in Crotona, which is where he wound up on the southeast coast of Italy. Maybe he said to people, here's something miraculous about math, knowing they hadn't heard of it. From the knowledge that I have at this point of his life, I would say it's quite possible he did that, but he did not invent it. But he was a genius in many other ways, none of which he's remembered for. So in any event, on my walk, I decide that I'm going to write a Pythagorean sonnet. And of course, I use a Petrarchan form. And I don't realize, actually, until the walk was over, that it was the Petrarchan form I was working in. And out of curiosity, I went and looked up Pythagoras. That first poem was actually... It used the Pythagorean metaphor somewhat by accident, and that was Pythagoras observing a flock of geese flying in very precise mathematical formation and concluding that the universe is basically made up of math, which was his view. I mean, I'm simplifying it tremendously, but his view in approximately 550 BC, which is being reflected in a lot of things going on right now in physics and cosmology and other areas of science. And, you know, this is 2,500 years later. His view was that the universe is mathematical, not that you use numbers to describe it or to get insights into it, but it's mathematical in that all the physical forms of the universe are actually the expression of the numbers underlying them. So in other words, if you find out that there are 2.86 trillion atoms in the average human being, the meaning of that is not to describe the human being, but to say that 2.86 trillion was a number out there looking for some meaning. And the meaning came about by the various fleshly forms in the world. It's not a particularly maybe pertinent point to people in their everyday lives, but it opened up a whole new level of intellect in describing the universe, which up until that point in the Greek tradition, you know, going back to the mythology a few centuries earlier, which was the most advanced in the world, no question, but it had not advanced that far. And that led to the other Pythagorean, the great insights, which I would describe them briefly at this point. One is that the Earth revolved around a central fire, not the sun, not in his time period, but he did believe that the Earth revolved around as a planet rather than as the center of the universe. There was a central fire, which is very similar to the sun, and then the sun was actually one of the planets. So although this is not the Copernican or Galilean revelation, it's you know, as a factual matter, it's much more advanced than what came to be developed through Ptolemy and what Aristotle accepted and so on. And it's way more advanced 2,000 years before the truth was learned, which is very typical if we look at the other Pythagorean doctrines. The other doctrines involve, first and foremost, transmigration of souls, which basically means that there is an immortal soul, but that it can take the form of various life forms over successive generations. So a human being in one generation may in their next life be a beetle or a flower or a kangaroo or anything. And that led to the development of an ethical philosophy that said that it was wrong to kill living things, and particularly wrong to kill them to eat them. So it makes Pythagoras, as was the claim made in the New Yorker magazine about 8 years ago, in an article that's become quite well known in the popular culture, the world's first vegetarian. But it wasn't just animals. The main tenets of progressive Pythagorean thought included the equality of women, okay, which is an issue that's still being wrestled with. This is now 2,700 years later. And also the emancipation of slaves, which of course has happened in the United States in the last 150 years, but I think still persists in some ways. So these are, and this is an original sort of primordial, almost political philosophy, which actually does become a political party in Rome. About 500 years after Pythagoras died, it did become a political party. But these are the basic insights that come down from, you know, the both the apocryphal sources and the very few actual sources, there are a few that exist of the time, and through the successive generations which began to really remember Pythagoras around 400 BC, and then over the next 500 years embellished his reputation, his legacy in a way that is similar to, although also in some ways very different from, the way in which Christ is developed as a prominent figure from the very beginnings of early Christianity. So at this point, I've sort of summed up, you know, the direct narrative that took place from writing the poem. I want to cover some of the other aspects of Pythagorean philosophy more specifically as they influenced poetry, but it's very, you know, resonant to me looking back at it that I sort of end up with this awareness of the importance that Pythagoras actually held for Petrarch, you know, which is a weird circle. I mean, because, and I have no doubt consciously that I was accidentally confusing the two names, which are not, they have a phonetic similarity, but they're not, you know, like anagrams of each other. And that, so that accidental mistaking of Pythagoras for Petrarch turned out to reveal a very powerful connection between Petrarch and Pythagoras in real time. And I do want to pause here to read a passage in one of the texts that I've been working with that says probably more, even though it uses Petrarch words, it makes this point more dramatically than I could make it as a person living in the 21st century, is the only way I could put it. So let me pause for a moment, and this is, first I want to give credit. There are two scholars, both of them writing in English, who have influenced me, and two books that I strongly recommend from the outset, both in the last 25 years when there's been a big outburst, at least in English. Also in some other cultures. I mean, there's actually, interestingly enough, there has been, in the academic community, quite a bit of funding for Pythagorean researchers coming from Italy. Okay, and that's interesting to me because that is part of the national story of Pythagoras. And of course, Crotona was on the Italian peninsula, but it was part of Magna Graecia. And the connection, though, to Petrarch and Dante, two of the greatest figures in the history of Italy, has not really been explored, except for one book in scholarship. But Pythagoras is much more, he's much more a Greek figure than he is an Italian one, despite the physical location in Crotona and later in Metapontum when his party was forced into exile. So what I'd like to do now, this is just a quote, and I will just give you a tiny bit more background. This is a book called Measuring Heaven, which was published 10 years ago by Cornell University Press by the independent scholar Christine Bourgier-Just. And, you know, she is someone who is an American, although partly Canadian. In this book, I mean, there's wonderful information on the actual connection of Pythagoras to poetry, which I'll be spending most of my remaining time on. But she also brings Pythagoras so powerfully into French history. And I would say France is not the, well, I would say the leading nations that actually are kind of involved in the Pythagorean narrative and not particularly, maybe totally understanding the scope of Pythagoras as a figure throughout the West are Greece first, Italy second, and France third. There are many connections between the history of French culture and the history of Pythagoras. And in fact, when Petrarch wrote the words I'm about to read, he was living in exile in France from two popes, the French Pope and the Pope in Rome. Petrarch is notable for being the only person in world history who was appointed the poet laureate of two nations on the same afternoon. He received a letter from the King of France and a letter from whoever was the comparable figure in Italy, two letters on a Saturday afternoon, telling him that he was the poet laureate of both nations at a time when he could not legally set foot in either nation on fear of being hung as a heretic. So that's just another little bit of historical window. But what I'd like to do now is just read a bit. This is Christine Gauger-Juice, revelation really of the connection between the two, and it will give you the flavor of how strong this is, because this is not, I read about Pythagoras in a book, I looked him up in the equivalent of the encyclopedia, I learned this and that. This is someone, one of the two or three greatest poets in the history of the West, who lives with Petrarch who lives with Pythagoras in his life in exile in a way that a very devout monk would live with Jesus and the Christian liturgy. And this is already 20, let me just make sure I have the math right. This is 1,800 years, almost 2 millennia after Pythagoras has died. So this will be a few paragraphs. And I'm just beginning with the description and then the quote directly from Petrarch, who in the quote blames all of the social and historical problems of Europe at the time. We know that those problems have not totally gone away 1,000 years later, but he blames all of the problems of the time, which were quite intense, on the fact that people are not following Pythagoras. Although he felt a strong aversion to the scholastic movement, Petrarch, a devout Christian with a strong instinct for the significance of classical texts, points to Pythagoras as the first philosopher and the one whose example can lead us to God. Petrarch knew a great deal about Pythagoras and admired him immensely. He contrasts idle philosophers with a Pythagoras who sounds virtually Christ-like. And here's the quote. Blind and deaf as they are, they do not even listen to Pythagoras, the most ancient of all natural philosophers, who asserts that it is the virtue and power of God alone to achieve easily what nature cannot, since he is more potent and efficient than any virtue or power, and since it is from him that nature borrows her powers. No wonder that they do not listen as well to Christ, the apostles, and the doctors of the church, all of whom they despise. I only wonder why they do not listen to this philosopher Pythagoras, or why they despise him. We have no right to suspect that these great judges of others have not read these words. However, it may be that they actually have not read them. Then let them read them in the second book of the commentary, which Chalcidius wrote on Plato's Timaeus, if any shame is left with them. Interesting thing about this passage, the first person to actually indirectly call Pythagoras the father of philosophy in texts that survive in their original form is in fact Plato. It's not Plato himself, who does mention Pythagoras once simply as a person he greatly admires, but a disciple of Plato who in a surviving text basically says that Plato regarded Pythagoras as the father of all philosophy and also as the model that he was emulating in his own life. Why don't we know this? Just speaking broadly about the culture of today, it's because Plato was a major figure in the early few centuries after Christ, as was Pythagoras, and he was distributed enough when the church decided really to censor out, with one exception, which I'll go on to in a moment, the philosopher Philo, but with that one exception, for a very specific reason, the references that Plato had made, which apparently in history were larger, were really censored out of the surviving texts that came, after the destruction of the Library of Alexandria. The church really had a lot of the surviving work of the ancient world, and they preserved, for example, the few plays we have by Aeschylus and Sophocles, and they just simply show. Now, there is no evidence whatsoever that Pythagoras ever wrote anything. There are many claims in the ancient traditions that begin in the 5th century BC that he did write, but there are also reliable accounts that when the Pythagorean party was forced to leave Crotona, that their headquarters was burned. And there's actually several sources. This is around 515 BC. And so it is possible that what writing he did was destroyed, or that there was a sort of a cult of silence among his followers that made writing maybe less. I've personally seen the same speculation about Shakespeare, that there is a ability to attach power to a figure that sort of is enervated when you know too much about them. So, the mystery of so little documentation of Shakespeare's life, the mystery of someone that is widely given credit for really amazing intellectual discoveries, that this person could have actually not written anything in a time when writing was already common. For example, the poet Sappho, who we do have many fragments from, is a contemporary of Pythagoras, slightly older, and there is actually a sort of a legendary narrative which relates to Pythagoras in poetry that shows that Sappho may even have met him or heard of him or been influenced by him. It's a little hard to believe that there was no writing, but the consensus that we have among scholars now is that if there was any writing, it didn't survive. That this is just to again put Petrarch's viewpoint in further perspective, is that all Petrarch or anyone else afterwards has is approximately 200 scholarly figures in the ancient world, among whom the most prominent is the Iamblichus, who wrote quite late in 200 AD. It's their writings at second, third, fourth, fifth removal that create the historical image that is influencing Dante and Petrarch, and they have these very consistent common themes that I've already mentioned: transmigration of souls, the earth revolving around a central fire, and ethical treatment not only of animals but also of women and slaves. These are in common, and they go all the sources all the way back. So let me, I don't think I have much time. Let me go over some of the more specific poetry connections, just to elucidate how Pythagoras gets connected with poetry over the centuries, and then I'm going to conclude with a quote about Dante. And the point here is that the main focus of Pythagorean thinking, which is that math is so important to the universe, which leads to a whole lot of development of thought about music, which is also an element, and certainly Pythagoras is associated very closely with the development of thought about music. He is carved on the facade of the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, most famously, and I didn't complete this thought on Christine Juvier, and that is that the French government actually, which is an interesting, Measuring Heaven, she wrote it as an independent scholar. It was published by Cornell. She brought it to the French government, and they actually, having read it and having realized how intertwined Pythagoras is with the history of France, they held receptions for it at the French consulate in Washington and also at the U.S. Embassy in Paris. And it did get quite a bit of attention in France, which to me was really encouraging, because I think this is such a neglected story that says, particularly in the case of Greece, I mean, everyone knows that Greece is the fountainhead of Western civilization, but this, as someone who has spent his life as a poet, this is such an up-close and immediate, powerful influence Dante, Petrarch, vicariously through Petrarch, Shakespeare. Another of Shakespeare's favorite poets was Ovid, who also wrote an entire book of Metamorphoses. That it really kind of sends chills down my spine. I mean, I feel that, you know, I'm totally not taking any credit for getting access to the narrative, but it's quite astonishing to me that all of this is there and it's really just been submerged. So let me just, I want to read a few things as briefly as possible, or briefly. This is a poet, and I'm reading this poem, it's very brief. It's because it's the first recorded poet writing about Pythagoras. This is around 400 BC. The poet's name is Empedocles. He's also known as the Philosopher. And this poem was written around 404 BC. The poem is lost, not surprisingly, for about 200 years, but then Porphyry, a subsequent scholar, brings it to light. And this one fragment of 6 lines is the first recorded writing about Pythagoras. Among them was a man of immense knowledge who had obtained the greatest wealth of mind, an exceptional master of every kind of wise work. For when he stretched out with all his mind, he easily saw each and everything in 10 or 20 human generations. So paying tribute really to the vast scope of Pythagorean insight. Secondly, I'm just going to read briefly from Ovid. Many of you perhaps are familiar with this material, but this is the 15th book of Metamorphoses, one of the most popular poems in terms of readership in the history of poetry, and also showing, and this now would be about 700 years after Pythagoras' death, whereas the Empedocles fragment is only 100 years later. But let me read the first stanza, beginning with line 60. It's brief, and it's on Pythagoras' doctrine of transmigration of souls and how that leads to the natural conclusion of vegetarianism. There was a man here, Pythagoras, a Samian by birth, who had fled Samos and its rulers, and hating their tyranny was living in voluntary exile, which would be Crotona. Though the gods were far away, he visited their region of the sky in his mind, and what nature denied to human vision he enjoyed with his inner eye. When he had considered every subject, though through concentrated thought, he communicated it widely in public, teaching the silent crowds who listened in wonder to his words, concerning the origin of the vast universe and of the causes of things, and what the physical world is, what the gods are, where the snows arise, what the origin of lightning is, what the gods most admire, whether Jupiter or the storm winds thunder from colliding clouds, what shakes the earth, by what laws the stars move, and whatever else is hidden. And he was the first to denounce the serving of animal flesh at table, the first voice, wise but not believed in, to say, for example, in words like these, human beings, stop desecrating your body with impious foodstuffs. There are crops, there are apples weighing down the branches and ripening grapes on the vines. There are flavorsome herbs, and those that can be rendered mild and gentle over the flames. And so this is the opening reference in what is an entire book, book 15 of the 18th book, Metamorphoses. Okay, so beyond these points then, there are many other poets in this 1,000-year period and many other thinkers. St. Augustine, for one example, actually has quite a intense relationship with Pythagoras and actually is accused in Measuring Heaven of having borrowed some of his mathematical ideas from Pythagorean thought. There is a school of thought in early Christianity that the idea of the immortal soul, although they do not accept transmigration of souls in the sense of being related to animals, that idea itself, the immortal soul of Christianity, actually originates from Pythagorean thought because it is not found in Judaism or in the Old Testament. The transcendental survival in the Old Testament is sort of the common soul of the ancient Hebrews, but not individual survival, but where it is found in the same time, in the same tradition, is in the works of Pythagoras. So it's not an unreasonable insight to think that there's a connection. And one of the people who speaks to it is St. Augustine, not a trivial figure in the history of Christianity. And yet, as I said, I went through many years of education and many different sort of intellectual areas of interest, and never understood who Pythagoras was, even on a scale of 1 in 100. So we kind of assume, I think, in some ways that we have a general body of received knowledge about the history of the world, and I'm certainly very averse to any hint of conspiracy theories. But this has taught me that, yes, we may have that, in the freedom that has developed since the Enlightenment, but we can't go back and change various decisions that were made about the reality and truth of knowledge 1,700 years ago that nobody even realizes were made. I mean, so that is perhaps, a general limitation that this is something I've, learned about for the first time in my life. I want to conclude briefly. This is this is going to be Dante, and just to say briefly, it's similar to the not similar, but the passage that I read on Petrarch. Petrarch and Dante were contemporaries. I obviously don't have the time to discuss the role of Dante. It's very much similar. It's more probably seminal than Petrarch, just in terms of Dante receiving credit as maybe the originator of secular literature after the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages, which came to be in general the Renaissance. So we're talking now about really someone who can be regarded not only as a historical literary, but also a historical cultural figure. And this is what Dante has to say about Pythagoras, and then I'll conclude. Dante Alighieri refers to Pythagoras 8 times. In the Convivio, a tribute composed in about 1305 to universal knowledge as a reflection of divine wisdom, he invokes the authority of Pythagoras in describing the meaning of science. For Pythagoras, Dante says, all is number, and it is number that regulates the universe and explains all natural things. Dante reminds the reader that it was Pythagoras who discovered and named philosophy. He explains Pythagoras' concept of the universe as a sphere. In discussing the modifications of this idea of geocentricity proposed by Plato and Aristotle, he affirms that Pythagoras was the first great authority on the order of the universe. Yet he also notes the humility of this distinguished mind in reporting that when asked if he was known as a wise man, Pythagoras replied that he was not wise, but just a lover of wisdom. So, concluding with that quote, which to me is extraordinary. I mean, it shows Dante, who is entirely described in biographies over the last 700 years, I would say entirely, not substantially, but entirely described as a poet wrestling with the secular viewpoint that appears in Vita Nuova, his first book, which is a collection of sonnets that he is then really threatened with death over. That his entire life consists of going into exile, connecting to various he connected to the secular army that the municipal government of Florence was essentially related to. Beatrice, who of course is his favorite and famous love interest, is widely believed to have actually been the daughter of the mayor of Florence. So he's wrestling with all this. So he's going back and forth between traditional religious belief and the hint of the secular. If you read Vita Nuova, there absolutely is no religious faith in it. I mean, he basically has worshipped Beatrice and is essentially saying life is not living without her, which was totally offensive to the clerical establishment. So you have an entire history of Dante that is framed completely in the clerical versus secular conflict in Florence. And yet the material in this book, of which I just read a very tiny sample, indicates that Dante's inner mental life, especially after he had completed the Divine Comedy, essentially revolved around the question of why Pythagoras had not been adopted as the really leading intellectual figure of essentially of eternity. I mean, this was the actual world he lived in. And you know, it's just something I think that is so compelling that from this point forward, I plan to dedicate a lot of research on this particular triangle, Dante, Petrarch, Pythagoras, because I think, you know, it's really something that the world needs to know. And I think it's also something that the world needs to know in terms of the position of Greece in the world, because it's another example that if you really look behind the veil of all the different historical and national accounts, I believe that you will see Greece much more an active role, not maybe last week or 3 years ago, but over the last 2,000 years, really since the rise of Christianity. Greece did not originate Christianity other than in the geographical course that it took. But Greece originated an entire philosophical view of the world, which Pythagoras was one of the originators of. And that philosophical view has been, and again, returning my last words to poetry, it's been far more crucial to the writing of poetry over the last 2,000 years than the more religious tradition. And the attitude of Dante and Petrarch proves it. And their influence on writers from Shakespeare to the present day is incalculable, and you can't separate out who influenced them from where we have arrived at now. So I believe, I'm just saying in terms of my own personal, very strange and accidental connection to the story, that I really feel it's important to go forward aggressively with it, especially in the United States, where I have some connections with the poetry establishment that will help me to really promote this and just get more knowledge on it, because it really has brought home to me how essentially everyone has Greek blood, really, if you're doing anything that's related to civilization. So thank you, and thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you for your captivating
No, thank you. Thank you.
speech. And I want to tell you a story, if you know it. Fishers from Miletus caught a golden tripod, and on the tripod it was written, "To the most wise." And they gave it to Thales, who refused. They gave it to Anaximander, etc. They refused. And finally, they tried to give it to Pythagoras. He refused, saying that I am not a wise man, like Periander and so on. I am a desiring of philosophy, of wisdom, philosophers. The philosophy had been born at that time. Mm-hmm. So the fishermen gave it to the oracle of Delphi. So I'll tell you a story. I have been traveling several times in the United States. You are a Southerner, aren't you?
No, New York.
New York.
New York's
So
thank you, though. I love the sense.
I was working in the 60s in Princeton, New Jersey, at the Institute of Advanced Study.
Oh, yeah. You
Writing-
followed Albert Einstein
writing
there in the
my
1950s.
Plotinus.
Yes.
And so I had to supervise the doctoral dissertation of a guy, an American guy. I was there with my wife and my dog. He invited me to his home, his residence, and I saw a dog. I am fond of dogs, and I asked him, what is his name? He replied, Pythagoras.
One of the most famous stories told of Pythagoras is that he saw a man kicking his dog and came over to him and said, don't you realize that could be your uncle? And the man stopped kicking the dog. So that's really ties together 2,500
I
years.
had several other things to tell you about Pythagoras, but I will give the other. Ποιος θέλει να λάβει το λόγο? Η κυρία πρώτη.
Απλώς ήθελα να του ζητήσω να λήξει. I wanted to,
Please
I wanted
ask your question.
to read us a sonnet.
Okay, thank you. So this is one of my Pythagoras poems. They're published in 3 books, but they've also had some individual attention. Probably the best audience has been one in the New York Times and one in Poetry Daily, which is a major poetry website in the United States. So I read a poem, the poem that was printed on Poetry Daily several years ago. It's called Burial of the Sun. What hieroglyphs trees' leafy shadows form upon a meadow glass bright with the gold demands of sinking sun, upon the warm blue remnants of a summer day grown old. Pythagoras can calculate how long before the sun inters itself once more. The angled math of shadows never wrong, and neither is hypotenuse of soar, triangulation by ascending hawk, whose broad-winged glide appears to climb the light. But how to measure on his evening walk the loss of his brief days to endless night? A final gleam of bronze enshrines this day. He ponders brevity, goes on his way. And if I could just add one brief thing. So on the that I had not heard that story before, which is a great story on the gold going to Delphi. Pythagoras, although originally regarded in history as a very modest man, in about the 3rd century BC, a variety of legends start to appear which deify him, and deify him as either the son of Apollo or Apollo walking the earth, which I just learned from Ginger is one of the columns, is Apollo in front of the, which was interesting. I mean, and the other is Athena?
Yes.
Yeah, so Apollo becomes intertwined with Pythagoras, and then you have the legend of the golden thigh, and that is where Pythagoras speaks to a crowd, and then afterwards gets in a conversation with the priest of the local cult of Apollo, and reveals to him that his thigh is made from gold, which is really very contrary to everything that Pythagoras is noted for before then, but it does become a sort of self-surviving legend, and if you go on Google right now and Google the golden thigh, I mean, Pythagoras with 10 million references will come up, but it's actually, in a way, I like your story much more, because I think it's truer to who Pythagoras actually was. So,
Thank you very much. Is there any other question, please?
Not at the moment.
Nobody?
Not at the moment.
For now.
Not at the moment.
Not at the moment.
okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your excellent lecture.
Thanks very much. I'd like to thank everyone here for coming out tonight.
Έχουμε δεύτερη ποιήτρια.
Yes. Thank you to the Center for Greek Philosophy, Dr. Evangelos Moutsopoulos, Dr. Protopapa, for the invitation to be here today. I'm also very grateful to be here talking with Lee, balancing Pythagorean and Heraclitean themes through poetics. Much of my work is a writer and polymath. I have great interest in specializing or working with architectural forms. And so from the formal sonnet to perhaps more abstract forms that are interwoven within the work, very, very, almost tempering, the balancing of opposites, very much as Heraclitus said, the everything and the nothing. And this whole idea concerns me, the concordant, discordant, the unity proceeding from all. This food for thought has really kind of sparked various threads of curiosity and interest. And just to go back a bit, I guess what I'm going to do is I'm going to give mythological and philosophical reference. I'm going to give some impressions, suggestions, and then some poetic monologue. And that's going to kind of how the dialogue will progress. Let me just say, from the Pre-Socratics to the or quantum physics, the way that the Pre-Socratics viewed metaphysics to quantum physics, we're reminded what Lee kind of touched on and what Dr. Moutsopoulos touched on. Einstein's work, he says everything is energy. Everything is energy, great. But what about the nothing? And what if the nothing, in very minimal terms, is actually space? And so, I thought about that, and I thought, that's kind of interesting. If everything and nothing, nothing and everything is basically our physical and non-physical cosmology, then how does that work on a minimal level versus, maximal level? So this whole idea that the nothing, follow me, is empty space, kind of the unshaped canvas, the pure potentiality of the void, touches on a theme that Aristotle talks about in De Anima, the nous and the dimorgos. And I see perhaps a parallel relationship, if you will. The nous being that infinite mind, possibly, that infinite pure potentiality, that divine feminine that is receptive to being shaped. And when it is in dialogue with the dimorgos, the energy, if you will, this infinite energy, masculine, seeds that space for creation. So, this whole, according to Proclus, the Platonic dimorghi is capable of modeling cosmic matter by conferring its form into unique harmony into the universe, and that's what Plato says in his Republic. So this whole idea that on a non-physical level, this whole idea of creation is happening versus on a physical level, we're co-creating in the shadow of the divine, very much similar to that methodology. So these whole energies, and I kind of envision this whole void or space or nothing very much like this. Symbolically speaking from the symbol, which is basically a zero, or as I actually prefer it in English or Greek, miden, which basically means nothing. And so the whole idea that the miden is in existence, and then we bring in the everything, which I kind of see as a wand or a one, okay? And this whole coming together or alignment and union creates a third entity, which is maybe, perhaps, viewed as the phi. So you have not so much you have the zero, the void of space, you have the energy, and it creates a third. So very similar also to the Pythagorean theorem, that in many regards, from a metaphorical perspective perhaps. So this whole idea that the cosmic universe, the dark and the light coexist, this duality, this balancing of, and this next poem, or this first poem I'm actually going to start with, talks about this in a very abstract sense, that these two entities exist in a harmonic state. And we know, for instance, the cosmic universe is primarily made up of dark matter. And dark matter was a bit of a quagmire for years. Scientists didn't really know what to do with it. And then they came along and they said, well, yes, about 65-75% of the universe is dark matter, and then we have light matter. But without the dark matter, we can't actually have the universe constantly expanding. So this whole idea of void, or volume and void, the everything and the nothing, the nous and the dimorphos, if you will, kind of interplay in and out with one another. And this poem is particularly dedicated to these ideas, if you will, matter of. What if dark matter were in truth an illusion of sorts, like an expansive cape spread that cloak the real shape beyond universal division, in situ of matter and antimatter soaked, in an ocean with or without visible or invisible cause, energy strung in harmony with luminous mass, like volume or void, infinite, filling the glass, space governed by cosmic hand, immutable laws, concordant and discordant written in ether, action and reaction inked less the paper, cosmology, unity, stemming from the sum, as breath fills the rounds of our lungs, expanding and collapsing in perfect unison, like stringing each pearl or bead one to one. So the idea that there's this balancing somehow of darkness and light, as Heraclitus said as well, as above, so below, as right as left. So he speaks about these dualities as Aeschylus speaks about the Titans, Prometheus and Epimetheus, and the themes that they teach us. We also understand many things about the non-physical and the physical world from the ancient Greeks. Specifically, the unity and opposites. And, where's the beginning versus the end, or where's the end versus the beginning? And maybe the end is actually a new beginning, or the beginning is actually an end. So really, depending on which side of that circular thought process you stand on, your perspective is shifted. Plato recounts in his Timaeus something we call the Ouroboros. And apparently this was something, the first living thing created in the universe, which came or became the earth itself. And we have a picture. I found a picture, basically.
May I have a look at it?
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
So, known as the Chrysobe of Cleopatra, this particular one, which is roughly 10th, 11th century, the inscription in Greek is en tout pain, which is one is the all. So this whole idea, or this kind of this whole idea that there's this circular dialogue of infinite, beginning and ending, really kind of forms, in many regards, this whole cycle of life, in essence, and how energy and space moves, kind of, and transforms. So heaven and earth, also two realities that have primordially emerged from the everything and nothingness in the biblical narrative Genesis. And here it's basically, from the get-go, these divinities, similar yet different, whose union results in the cosmology of the Greek gods, as Hesiod talks about. But also in the book of Genesis, very specifically talks about this beginning, and I'll just read you the first 4 lines. In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. The earth was without form and void. Darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovering over the face of the waters. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw the light, that it was good, and divided the light from the darkness. So certainly there are many layers and dimensions to any thought or words or shape or form that we talk about, and certainly there are in a poem. And this next poem I'm going to table is basically, again, it talks about these two entities, these opposing entities that come together in alignment to form a third. It's entitled Luna. It is about the moon. And, I'll read it for you and you'll hear it. Luna. She is the moon goddess who receives light from Apollo as they conceive, pour ether into a cup of fire, water. 2 yet one in alchemic union, hands that share. She is Selene, Xasteria's radiant beacon, caressing the seas Ionian to the Aegean, while she heals today the eternal now clean, uniting Anna K. Anna, seen yet unseen, as Athena Pallas shields all who ask, protective. Luna is nurturing, emotive, like magic encircled by etheric mass, unbending time, space, to reveal the ends, which in truth are new beginnings that stem from a pairing of trust, love, of kindred friends. So, Selene or Luna, being the Greco-Roman deity of the moon, Plato talks about, or Aristophanes references this in Plato's Symposium, that the moon is actually androgynous. So we have the sun, which is divine, masculine, and we have the earth, which is divine, feminine, and we have the child of the two, which is the moon. And he talks about a couple of references to this. Another reference I will actually get to in another poem in a bit called Psyche's Cup. But first I would like to say, again, we have this balancing of dualities, these opposites coming into alignment, forming a new creation. This symbiotic merging of two that yield the sum of a new or third energy, which is together greater than their individual parts. So in keeping with the ideology that there is this energy in space and this, let's say, universal language that we all, animate or inanimate, speak, this language of vibration, if you will, frequency. And I think the Pre-Socratics actually, they were aware of this, but they couldn't actually perhaps prove it in scientific terms. We can now prove it on a quantum physics level, that everything has vibration, whether it be animate or inanimate. So the universe is always listening. Regardless if you're talking, if you're thinking, if you're feeling, it is always listening. At least that's how I perceive it, based on my journey, if you will. So, I also kind of envision this porous universal mesh, this veil that imbues the volume and void. And, Jung talks about it, and also we have a reference to the Akashic records, which, if you want to translate it, kind of seems like the collective consciousness, or the universal library, if you will. But anyway, so there's this universe that's always listening, always recording, always kind of absorbing this energy that's being transformed and reshaped and shaped. So I also came, when I was doing some work, I stumbled upon, I guess about a year ago, a hymn which I was very much inspired by. It was a hymn of Cleanthes, the Stoic philosopher, and a hymn to Zeus, or Hymnos to Dios. And so I began looking at it in more careful terms, and I translated it from, and I translated, first I looked at like various translations that were there, and then I wanted to look at the ancient Greek, because I always realized that, there's always distortion in translation. And I don't just mean language to language, but even from, like, the sound I hear is very different from the sound maybe you hear, or the color I see, or the tone that I see. So these frequencies resonate very different to us and from us. So looking into this hymn to Zeus, if you will, and carefully going through it, I worked it into a sestina form. It really talks about this dialogue from the god, or the gods to man, and man back to the gods or God, or however you perceive the divine, if you will. And so I'm going to read it. And curiously enough, the Stoics didn't necessarily believe in prayer, simply because they believed that they were in divine or dialogue with the divine logos, or divine logic. So that's kind of an interesting thought to keep in mind, that basically the thoughts, the feelings, the dialogue, that inner dialogue, that external dialogue, was very much in alignment with the divine. So, invocation. Noblest one, called most powerful ruler you, Lord of nature, governing all by your divine law, Zeus, I call upon thee. It is just any and all address you. Our origin, design, bear likeness to your line like too. And we live, move as myriad creature, physical on earth akin to you. Arguments. I sing your praise, this constant rule, as universe whole spinning round your truth, while obeying your beacon call, led by the hand that rule, and lightened servant in palm you prove by your electric bolt sounded by thunder through, jagged sword sent fast, fierce when you brood, stroked by all and guided as energy in space, your reason universal that permeates the divine theater, directed by you, mingled from the great, yet twinkled by the minute, the minute starlight of you, almighty your infinite intelligence does soothe, orchestrated wise from the consciousness through and through in divinity, celestial sphere, gifted by your oceans imbued. I'm going to stop there. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I find it very interesting that through this hymn, this very simple hymn, this poetic hymn, Cleanthes, and this is my impression, this is why I felt as I was working through this poem, he was actually trying to tell us something. I think he was actually trying to impart not just literature, history, poetry, but perhaps a manifesto of how one communes to source and vice versa. So there's this whole dialogue, this circular dialogue of balancing, the heaven on earth, or as above, as so below. Which brings me to another point, very Heraclitean, if you will, aletheia, perspectives of truth. So, as we know, aletheia in Greek is very, very much simply the disclosure in a philosophical sense of truth. But the word, etymologically speaking, is a very interesting structure, because you then can extract the antonym of aletheia from its part or its center, lethe. And lethe being the concealment, or the concealment of truth, if you will. And so Plato touches upon, in his symposium where he asks Aristophanes to present a story of soulmates, or two souls. And he references a four-armed, four-legged creature with a head with two faces. And apparently Zeus divides this creature in half, according to the Greek myth. And basically, this one, or this creature in separation, the human being, if you will, spends its life or lives in search of its other part, or whole. And this reminded me very much of, this whole star-crossed lovers of Psyche and Eros, and how they were held in separation or held in non-alignment for much of their story. And again, Lethe, not only being the mid part of Aletheia, the word, is also the mythical river that runs through Hades. And it is said she is apparently the daughter of Strife, Eris, and it is said her waters are given to those who pass into the netherworld, either after death, after the soul, if you were, the soul transforms or leaves the earthly life. But I also wonder if perhaps, again, there could be some distortion here, and very simply wonder if even in sleep, hypnos, one actually traverses into this communion with Lethe, if you will. So Psyche's cup. Come, beloved one, drink from the river Lethe, hypnotic waters that sparkle dizzy, to forget the parted memory of the twin soul, not the other half, but rather your whole. She is obliged, the river goddess, to him, Hades, of whom she flows like fluid emotion, as sleep into the netherworld of oblivion. Imbibe her essence and allow the dark to dim, in complete forgetfulness made numb. Drink from the daughter of strife and heal your wounds clean from earthly life. Your reunion comes with the chaliced cup, tonic to relieve the heart's wounds, soothe. Come, child, drink, embrace divine truth. So, I'm going to close on part of a poem, part of a sonnet cycle, if you will, that progresses a new piece of work, a forthcoming piece of work. It progresses Sophocles' History of Antigone, and it's entitled Therapy with Antigone. And basically, the sonnet cycle, which is written as a play, we enter this whole, we find Antigone, if you will, after she at the end of Sophocles' play, she's transformed this energy into the netherworld or the afterworld. And she's basically in dialogue with her spiritual guides, this non-physical form, these forms. And here she's speaking to memory, Metatron, and source. And there are 3 acts, but I'm going to read just a fragment of. And very much similar to what Cleanthes talks about, that there is this dialogue between the physical and the non-physical, and vice versa. So, intersource and Antigone. I am as you are, present for time, timelessness, where memory lingers in full consciousness, lessons in archaeology that build the what, when, why, the how we will. I want you to know that you are whole, one, seemingly two, this is your soul. For it is you, dear child, Antigone, that I comfort now in all your agony, releasing the guilt, the fear of delusion, that in clarity truth is just an illusion. Karma which you carry, I now unweave. This wrath that bleeds, I unblock, delete. The burden that hearkens heavy permeates. Allow the forgiveness to offer a new start, for you are a radiant child of light, who beacons illuminates shadows bright. Even the fog, the mist of darkness that adheres, or doesn't allow the angels' choir near, make resolution now with your higher self. Leave the resentment, anger on the shelf. For Metatron, Thoth, to remember as royal scribe, call upon your like deity, intuition unblind. Following this guidance is truth, your purity, nous times divine which wields your psyche, like Aristotle voiced out loud in Danima. It is me who first shaped intellectual capital, the any, the all, I am the mind of the one who governs the everything, nothing, the sum. So, thank you very much. Thank you.
The applause of your audience was so sincere.
Thank you.
And
Thank you very much. I'm
mine.
grateful for you.
I
being here.
judge from my applause. Now, I am sure that you have been experiencing consciously what you said. And I am also sure that you have touched the nucleus of the problem. You are experiencing consciously the poetry. And I know that because I know that very well, because we have been working together.
Yes.
Thank you so
Grateful.
much.
Thank you.
Ερωτήσεις.
Ναι, κύριε Δελγιώργη.
I would like to ask you about the meaning of the terms you use.
Yes, of course.
Usually, the opposite of nothing is being, not
Yes.
everything. And even we use the term everything in relation to pan, the
Yes.
Parmenidean pan. Then Parmenidean pan is not everything, is rather a totality under the form of unity.
Yes.
And this totality, which is unity, equates with cannot be not nothing. For Parmenides excludes the possibility of the existence of something which is nothing. But after that, I realize that you don't remain to what Parmenides says, because afterwards nothing has taken a certain meaning. But in philosophy, the opposite of nothing is being, not everything. Everything is total, not total or everything. This is the one, for me, it's quite a problem. Everything is the opposite of nothing, which equates with the void. The other term, which also for me, I just am wondering if is the term lethe, the oblivion, that you give the meaning of concealment, the Heideggerian approach of oblivion. Concealment in the sense of intended concealment, perhaps. But lethe means oblivion.
Yes, but I think it also...
So even as oblivion, the opposite cannot be nothing.
Well, here's what I was talking about, and it's a good question. Thank you very much for asking. Here was what I'm talking about. I think there's distortion in a third-dimensional reality. So I think we're also talking about labels here in translation and perceptions of labels in translation. So it's like when you look through a lens of or a camera. You see maybe 95% like what's in front of you, but then there's like 5% distortion. So yes, you raise a good point. Parmenides basically says, I think the everything and the nothing is the eternal state of being. I think being is one. Everything is one. And we try to quantify in very physical terms, three-dimensional terms now. And there is kind of a distortion from the trickle-down theory, from the non-physical to the physical, what these labels are. So lethe, I was quite drawn, A, to the mythology, and A, to the actual etymology of the aletheia and lethe in the Greek, as well as what it symbolized, the waters of to forget. You were actually given upon entry of Hades this water to imbibe, to basically, it is my interpretation, my impression, that you're giving these waters to relieve your earthly strife, the suffering, the pain. So I think we play with metaphors and labels here, but yes, thank you, it's a good point.
Before I agree, we have always the union of the two opposites. I don't know if you know about this Hegelian reality, the first Hegelian, the first three categories in Hegelian logic.
Yes.
Being as nothing becomes something. This is the first. Yeah.
But again, I think there's this thing again with, and I'd like to draw that back to a time reference, because I think the three states of being, as you've just said, I think that is a linear third-dimensional way of the way we perceive time in essence. And I think we perceive time as past, present, future. And I think time in essence is really space, and it is an illusion or a synthetic construct of understanding how all of this, the energy and the space that moves through it. So maybe it's just all the eternal now, right? And maybe we are just experiencing it as, human being, third dimensional, on a timeline, going, yes, this happened yesterday, this is today, this will happen tomorrow. It's a perspective. I just put it out there for food for thought.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Zoller. I don't have any question. I just want to thank you because you showed us another dimension of seeing the early Greek philosophy, which is precious. I mean, it is something unique. And myself and Maria, yes, we have worked on Stoicism, and we all know that Claritas was inspired by Heraclitus and everything. But this way of seeing things, only a poet can discover it, this dimension. And we really thank you. You discovered Heraclitus behind Antigone, behind, of course, Claritas that we know, the old Stoics were inspired by Heraclitus, but not in the poetic way, in putting things in a rather ethical viewpoint more than in looking to the inner dimension of humans. I was impressed, and really, thank you. I don't have any questions. They were wonderful.
Thank you for listening.
And even Aristotle in the Dialogue, yes, you saw Heraclitus, yeah. Never seen of that.
Thank you. How does lethe as a river?
Lethe is a river, yes.
Yeah. How does it work with the idea of concealment rather than
So
oblivion?
basically, as the soul entered into Hades, after, let's say, it passes or transforms that like energy of earthly life into the netherworld or afterworld, they are offered the water of Lethe, which Hypnos, again, is very close in Hades. So you are offered basically to drink from the water of Lethe. And that, in essence, it basically, in my interpretation, it basically washes away that earthly pain, that strife, that suffering. So it conceals the pain, that strife, almost as you experienced it on an earthly plane, if you will.
But if it conceals it, it doesn't wash it away.
I agree with you, but I hear you. So again, I think there's some like levels of interpretation and distortion. Lethe, as a definition, we know what it is. It is the opposite of truth, or aletheia, in a very Heraclitean sense. I think again, mythology is filled and layered with many facets and layers. So perhaps it is a choice, right? You drink from the cup or drink from the river Lethe to not remember. Perhaps we are actually walking around in a state of Lethe now, in a conscious state, and the subconscious is basically, all this stuff there we're not aware of. So, it's a question of perspective. Like, which side of like line do you stand on to perceive? Is the cup empty, or is it full, or half empty?
And perhaps practically
Is there
it's
another person who would like to take the floor?
Please.
You.
Thank you both of you for your presentation, but could we please settle things down a little bit, because not in strictly philosophical terms, but of course, if we are to speak about philosophical subjects on poetical terms, it is easy for all of us to exaggerate in the exploitation of metaphors. For example, there was already discussion on the etymology of aletheia relating to Lethe. Who said this is so?
Well, if you look at the word,
Yes.
okay, and in an ancient Greek context, or in a Greek context, Lethe and aletheia. Okay, look, not from a philosophical Heraclitean sense, but Heraclitus was very keen on this aletheia, this truth.
Yes.
Okay, so expand that.
One moment. The main source for this kind of etymology, for the specific etymology, is Heidegger, and the reference in his Introduction to Metaphysics. And in ancient Greek, it is quite comfortable either to make a composition of words, either by putting the negative a with a positive noun, or by using this a without negative point, as in the example of Adelphos, in the meaning of coming from the same Delphis. As Aristotle says, etymology has no apodictic value.
Okay.
It is related to analogical way of thinking, and its conclusions are mainly just indicative, which actually is a simile with our situation here, because no one can be sure that the Stoics' view or Aristotle's disciples' view upon the interpretation of what Pythagoreanism really was are quite so. And it could be, for example,
Again, distortion.
Of course. And I could just offer you another distortion. Aletheia being derived, for example, could be from the noun iali, which means plani, and the verb theaume theome,
Help our English speaking.
which is not semantically very different
Yes.
from your point of view, but it helps you avoiding any relation to oblivion being mistaken as or being interpreted as concealment.
Okay, good point. Thank you very much for kind of like laying that out in very structured terms. Yes, I'm not quoting Aristotle here on the etymology on aletheia. What I am, or my perspective that I am tabling, is the word aletheia as a Greek word, okay? And it's seemingly opposite duality within one. So there's the one that is two, the two that is one. So following that circular process, you're extracting from the word aletheia, and then you get lethi, right? And then weaving in the mythological references and whatnot. So, yes, I find it curious. I don't believe in coincidence. I thought it was food for thought. And I liked how you explained it in very philosophical, from Heidegger's perspective. I think it's a good way to also see the Greek language. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thanks. So,
Lucas,
yeah. Come on, now you must give something away of your insight. I mean, about the three dimension of the three, yeah, especially on the Newtonian three-dimensional universe and how it relates with the tension between everything and nothing. Misleadingly, perhaps, as I...
Okay, can you tell me
yeah,
again? So,
yeah, because you, the impression was given to me that you tend to think there is a relation between the Newtonian three-dimensional universe, right?
Well, I'm suggesting
yeah.
that they're in a three-dimensional
yeah.
reality,
Right.
okay? That there is distortion, depending on what we're looking at. You know, if we're looking at a fifth-dimensional perspective versus a third-dimensional perspective, or just a two-dimensional perspective. It's like if you envision, if you look at a cube, right?
Right.
Supposedly a cube is 3D,
Right.
but then make it into a tesseract. You're experiencing a fifth dimension, but really seeing it from a fourth-dimensional perspective. See what I'm saying?
No.
Well, yes, if you look at, so basically the cube is like a cube in a cube, right?
In how
A
many
tesseract,
dimensions?
right?
Right.
So that's just kind of like an example, but your question is simply the three-dimensional.
No, I like the example yeah. That,
Yeah, I don't have a picture of
so,
the tesseract to kind of put on the table.
we are living in one dimension below the appropriate.
One always perceives
dimension.
one-dimensional below the dimension we're kind of,
So we're living
existing. On a quantum physics level, huh?
We're living in n+1 dimensional universe, but we only perceive n dimensions.
Well, if you look at a building, if you go outside and you look at that building, you can't see the whole three dimensions of that building. You can only see two sides. You see what I'm saying? Like, view as a piece of this architectural form, you experience the two dimensions of it, even though you know it has a backside, which you can't see.
But I can walk down this road.
You can, and you have to walk around and possibly see it from back. Anyway, so I ask you to see it from the juxtaposition of dimensions.
I'm still experiencing the third dimension.
Yes?
Though no, I'm walking down this road. Now I'm leaving the building and I'm going to this restaurant that I'm going to have some dinner. And I'm in doing so, I'm experiencing all three dimensions, not two.
Not at once. Not at once. Yes.
Άλλος, υπάρχει άλλη ερώτηση? Αν δεν υπάρχει, τότε να ευχαριστήσουμε και να συγχαρούμε άλλη μια φορά. We congratulate you for your aphorism today.
Thank you.
and your contribution to our seminar.
Thank you for allowing us to be here today.